There isn't just one action that can stop COVID in its tracks, but taking personal measures and building healthy habits will help to protect us all. COVID-19 spreads in confined spaces, crowded places and close contact settings. Wash your hands regularly and practice good hand hygiene. Carry a face covering at all times and wear it in any crowded or busy places. Increase your distance when you can and seek out fresh air either by meeting outdoors or increasing ventilation indoors. These little personal steps will really help add up and protect not only you, but those around you. Lateral flow device kits are available free of charge to everyone in the Isle of Man. You can order them online at gov.im/COVID-19 or collect them from any participating pharmacy. It is recommended that everyone test every 3 to 4 days. In the last few weeks, almost 70% of positive PCR tests were identified thanks to an initial LFD test, making them a really important tool to uncover hidden cases of the virus. Vaccinations are effective in preventing severe illness, hospitalisation and even death. The vaccination programme is available to all island residents aged 16 and over and provides our greatest collective defence and ability to manage COVID-19 long term. It takes just 1 minute to register for the COVID-19 vaccination and it could save you from severe infection. Be safe, be smart, be kind for our island.
Hello and welcome to Election 21 Question Time. In this edition, we feature the candidates looking to represent the constituency of Douglas Central. Joining me on the panel are Damien Chappelli, Anne Corlett and Chris Thomas. Sarah Hackman is also standing but was unable to join us for this event. Following the election on September the 23rd, 2 of these candidates will be elected to the House of Keys. Before we start the questions, we're giving each candidate up to 2 minutes to introduce themselves. And first up, we have Damien Chappelli. Damien.
Hello, good evening, Richard. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Damien Chappelli and I am standing for the general election next month for the House of Keys. I am Manx born and was educated and raised on the Isle of Man. I was educated at St Ninian's and King William's College. I am an Isle of Man advocate by profession. I have both Manx and Italian ancestry. My mother being a Clegg and my father obviously being Chappelli. I am standing as an advocate for change because I believe that the Isle of Man needs to look at the way it does things in a way that ensures that it is practical, people-focused and appropriate for the needs of the public. As an advocate, I bring with me a wealth of experience, having worked advising blue chip companies, having worked away in Luxembourg, gaining an international perspective and offering that to the people of Douglas Central so that the experience, my legal training and my understanding of legal risk amongst other things can be brought to bear for the benefit of the people of Douglas. In terms of high-level policy, I would advocate to look at ways of improving efficiency overall. That would basically be achieved by 3 pillars. The first being to assess and consider the size and scope of government. Secondly, to apply savings from that to driving forward our economy. And thirdly, targeting those the increase in income and ensure that our frontline services are protected and boosted. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Anne Corlett.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Anne Corlett, and I've had the absolute privilege of representing the constituency of Central Douglas as their MHK for the past 5 years. Nationally, my priorities for the next 5 years are economic recovery, health, education, safety, housing, and climate change. I'm passionate about social policy, and serving as a department member in both health and education has really given me the opportunity to start to bring about change and to understand and to help shape some of the services that many of us depend on. But there really is so much more to do. Driving the economy is vital in order to provide the services that are essential for our island community. It really will take hard work and commitment on the part of our representatives if we're to truly overcome the financial challenges and to provide opportunities for all. My continued aims for the constituency of Douglas Central include suitable primary and secondary school facilities, a decent road network, I should say, a lower speed limits in residential areas, especially those roads surrounding schools, and reforming the planning regulations to provide a fair and equitable system. I want to be part of the hard work of the next 5 years to achieve the best for our island. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Chris Thomas.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to Studio One and to Energy for hosting this hour-long discussion. I'm Chris Thomas, and I thank the constituents of Douglas Central for electing me at the by-election in 2013. I hope that I will be re-elected in 2021 to continue the work that we've started, because there is still a lot of work to be done. I'm a glass half full person. We have to admit that there's lots of good things about the island. At heart, we're caring and prosperous. Government is beginning to reform and transform itself. But there are huge challenges that we face: housing, how to begin the just transition in the light of climate change that's affecting us all in this island and in fact in the whole globe. We've also got issues with the fact that the economy hasn't worked for everybody for the last 10 years. Many have benefited greatly from it, but not everybody. So what does the Isle of Man, the House of Keys, Douglas Central need from the next MHK representing Douglas Central? Well, firstly, it needs a policy agenda, the right policy agenda, and that's what I've prepared as my manifesto, and that's what I'll be submitting to the constituents, launched on the 1st of September at my launch meeting at 7 o'clock in All Saints Church Hall. Secondly, it needs an MHK with capability, and I can demonstrate that through my track record. And thirdly, it needs an MHK with politics, with tactics to get things done, because making change, bringing about reform is all about working with others, listening, being authentic, and actually taking people with you when you propose change through questions, motions, and legislative reform. Thank you. Thanks
very much, Chris. So on to the first question. One of the 3 strategic objectives in the programme for government, the last administration of course, was the delivery of a financially responsible government. In your view, what does being financially responsible represent? Do we have to raise taxes, or would you commit to reducing the costs of government to ensure we can maintain our increasingly costly essential public services? And I will give that to Damien first. Thank you.
Okay. I think financially responsible has to start with the basic budgeting and housekeeping of the Isle of Man government. The Isle of Man government enjoys a tremendous income, not least because it enjoys a very healthy revenue from VAT receipts, amongst other things. The income of the Isle of Man, not many people know, but is just over £1 billion. And I think it behoves the government to show and demonstrate that they are being responsible with those monies, both in terms of the size and scope of government, which is the first pillar of, I believe, reform going forward, and looking at potential liabilities downstream, such as the thorny subject of public sector pensions. And so I think that by reducing the size and scope of government, I mean, I've talked about the cost, but also that we've got to look at the scope. And the scope requires us to consider whether, in fact, the services provided by the government could, in certain aspects, be provided by the private sector, again, reducing the burden on the taxpayer. So the issue of budgeting and housekeeping is fundamental, I feel, because the Isle of Man enjoys this income, and then it can then focus on driving forward the economy. The question of tax rises is, of course, something that is a possibility further down the line if our income is reduced. It is constantly under threat because, of course, the United Kingdom Chancellor can cut the rate of VAT and we would have to follow. And if it did so, it would result in a substantial reduction without even doing any changes to the Common Purse Agreement that we have. So that is something. Of course, we've got the prospect of the threat to our corporate tax regime, and that is both a potential opportunity and, of course, a danger, because if, in fact, we were required to apply a corporate rate that was consistent with some global requirement, we might find that our whole tax framework has to be reconsidered. So we are going to have to be nimble and fleet of foot here to respond to the changes, and I think anticipate them as they come down the line. But I say again, I think that having seen the numbers of public servants and you know, the public servants that we have are doing a fine job, but we have to be responsible.
Okay, I might come back to you on the scope of government. Chris Thomas, what's your view? What does financially responsible government look like?
So in 2016-17, when the programme for government was launched, financially responsible government was defined in terms of reducing the structural financial deficit. And in those terms, the 2016-2021 government failed, in as much as the structural financial deficit was 50 million in 2016, and it had risen to 150, 160, 170, 180 million, perhaps even 190 million by 2021. You can say, in part, that's to do with COVID, and it's a special year, but it's also a symptom of the fact that we've got to approach even that measure of responsibility differently next time. And what I believe is that the programme for government, which started well with the Treasury Minister and myself going around to departments, needs to actually produce, after 3-4 months, a costed programme for government. What actually happened last time was the departments and the other spending bodies more or less ignored the programme for government and then sneaked in business as usual afterwards. One of the biggest successes in terms of being financially responsible in those terms, and later on in the discussion I'll come back to other meanings of responsible, but one of the biggest successes was actually the public sector pension situation. So back in 2016, we had a reserve that was expected to finish before the end of this administration, and we had an expected 60 million funding gap when that reserve was extinguished. We managed to push the reserve out 2 years, and the funding gap is halved to 30 million. Another success was that the public servants came along with the government and actually put in place a 4-year, in the end, pay arrangement to provide financial stability. The failure, I believe, hinted at it, which was that we lost control of what was going on. But the other big failure was that the initial SAVE programme achieved practically nothing. It slowly evaporated. And then at the end, we had a splurge of financing under the ambit of Economic Recovery Group. And by that stage, I was out of government. And we really did spend masses, including £100 million from the National Insurance Fund.
Okay, thank you. Anne Corlett, what's your view?
My view is, to be financially responsible, we need to balance the budget. We need to build reserves for a sustainable future. It's housekeeping, really, good housekeeping. I think we need to prioritise the budget. We should consider what we must do, what we should do, and then what we could do if we could afford it. I think we have to remain competitive in the tax world, and I think that we should review NI contributions I think there is certainly money to be gained from that. There are too many loopholes, legal loopholes, that could be closed to increase revenue. Rather than borrowing, I think I'd like to see the issue of some bonds to give the Manx people a little bit of a return on their investment, on their savings.
Thank you. Damien, you mentioned the scope of government. What should government not be doing that it's doing at the moment?
Okay, well, I think that if we consider, for example, the issue of leisure and entertainment, and I'm thinking in particular of the Villa Gaiety Arcade Complex. Now, about 10 years ago, as I recall, the Chamber of Commerce remarked that it was basically losing about £1 million a year by way of public subvention. And at that time, I can recall that there was what I'd call a beauty parade of private investors that were looking to take on the responsibility of running those venues. But for whatever reason, that came to naught. I believe that subject to some subventions to protect local cultural and amateur dramatics groups, we should look to put that into the private sector, because I believe that they're best placed to run an entertainment and arts complex such as the Villa Gaiety institution. And I say that because we need a boost to our visitor economy, and I feel that in the hands of government there isn't the incentive to drive it forward, and there isn't necessarily the expertise or the network to do that. That is not to disparage the efforts that are being made by our public servants, but it's to ensure that, for example, that very substantial investment by the Manx government actually creates a return and doesn't cost so much money. It's been taken over by the Department of Education. I regard that as inappropriate. I don't see what business the Department of Education has in the entertainment business, quite frankly. But it seems to me to be a way of absorbing that cost, and therefore there's a lack of transparency as well.
Okay, thanks very much. It used to be in the Department of Economic Development. I guess they would argue that it shouldn't have been there either. And call it. Damien's mentioned the Villa Marina. The airport's often mentioned as an example of something that could be privatised.
Absolutely.
Do you have anything specific that you could refer to?
What we shouldn't be doing is overspending on capital projects in the way we are. I do think we need a project management hub or unit that oversees the major projects. It's costing us literally millions that we could be ploughing into essential services. That is the main thing for me.
So it's not necessarily smaller government, it's smarter government.
Absolutely smarter government.
Chris Thomas?
Well, if we go back to the scope and structure of government reports of 2006 and then again 2012, I think the general public will actually find that most of the recommendations that were made and agreed have actually been tried out and implemented, or they're about to be under the work that was done under the single legal entity committee recommendations, which are now on the table as modified, particularly with the one public service. And just to pick up on something that Damien said, it's so fine worrying about the Villa Gaiety complex, but that's maximum 1,000th of the expenditure of government. And a very wise former MHK from Douglas West said to me once, Chris, don't worry about the 20, 30 million of good things about the Isle of Man, focus on the big things. So if we're going to save money, we've got to actually look at the wage bill. We've got to look at social security. We've got to look at pensions, which is £200 million plus for the state pensions. We've got to look at large chunks of money, and most importantly, we've got to look at health and social care. And so, for instance, a massive saving there, which has been well planned by the Health and Social Care Department that Anne's a part of, would be the fact that inevitably, because of the scale of the island, the costs of providing healthcare in the island are greater than they are in the UK. But the transformation team has estimated that that accounts for 60% of the excess, but 40% is currently unexplained. So to me, that's the 40% we should be trying to get, because that's 40% of the extra costs in 340 million or something like that, and that would be a large amount of money. And to be frank, the Villa Gaiety complex needs that subvention, and it's a wonderful facility that we're privileged to have in the island alongside all the regional facilities as well, and that's safe in my hands.
Sorry, Damien, just one more thing.
May I reply? I think the point about the Villa Gate is it's but one example, and I think the point about it is that we're looking to drive forward our visitor economy, and I don't feel that the Villa Gaiety complex in government hands is fit for that. I appreciate politically that may be an unpopular statement for me to make, but I think it's important to drive the visitor economy forward so that there are attractions and shows and arts attractions that would bring people over because they spend money, they use accommodation, they attract other positive things as well. I think that government can be looked at in terms of its scope. You know, should a lot of the roadworks be carried out by government employees, or can there be the better use of private contractors? And I think when you look at that in the round, there may be significant savings had.
Okay. Anne, do you want to add anything at this point?
No, I would agree with Damien that actually putting things out to the private sector is really important and saves money in pensions and employment through government. What I would say is, though, that there has to be real scrutiny on contracts, service level agreements and the commissioning process itself. I don't think that's been tight enough. I think that will change with the evolving of Manx Care. But I think we've been very lax on how we monitor contracts and service level agreements.
Okay, thank you. Just want to move it on. Your constituency includes the major business district in the capital, Douglas. So I just want to move on to a question about the economy. In a recent Chamber of Commerce survey, diversifying the economy was ranked the fourth most important area for businesses. What actions would you take if elected to ensure that the island maintains a diverse economy which attracts new talent and ensures there are relevant sectors for returning graduates? And Chris, take you first, thanks.
So the last time a consultancy firm helped us with the economy was back in 2012 with Ernst & Young, and Ernst & Young concluded in 2012 that we had one of the most diversified small economies in the world compared to other international business centres and crown dependencies. So my starting point is we've got to protect the fact that we've already got over 20 sectors in the Isle of Man that employ more than 500 people, which is a much more diversified economy than Jersey, Guernsey and other international business centres around the world. The second point I would make with that strong starting point is that we've got to work with the local businesses, particularly those that are important parts of clusters, export-facing clusters, to actually support them. And that doesn't mean wasting money on big projects and big funding schemes like the Enterprise Development Fund or the Media Development Fund. What it means is actually thinking through where there's high value added work that we could do in the island, given the issues that we have to do with our scale and location, to do with the skill set that we have from returning graduates and from people who are likely to want to live here, and basically the scale of the operation. You know, when it comes to the new jobs in the green sector, we can't manufacture massive wind turbines, but we could do specialist parts of some aspects of alternative energy. So that's the way that I would think of it. And the final point I would make is, although I wouldn't go as far, it seems, as either Damien and Anne in terms of using the private sector, I do think it's about time that we moved on from the concept of the Department for Enterprise. And I do think that the enterprise agencies should actually be given more of their own head, and more of their own accountability, but also more responsibility themselves. And that's an absolutely important part of my manifesto.
Okay, thanks. And call it.
I mean, I think we really need to continue to support diversification and support, actually, I agree with Chris on this, the executive agency model of DFE. You know, they are providing leads on new and emerging sectors, and they're responsible for product development, promotion and policy input. But I think they need more teeth, and not more teeth, more support. I think that's something that we should really be looking at pushing forward in the next administration. I think also on a positive note, the new economic strategy review is well underway now with KMPG Global, and they're considering all aspects of our economy, including the sectors, tax and the 0-10. and they're going to provide policy recommendations for decision. So I'm really interested to see what they come back with, actually.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Damien.
Okay, I think the diversification of our economy is very important. However, I think to some extent it's very easy to pay lip service to this principle and cite reports here and there. If you talk to people in business, you will hear very worrying news regarding our banking sector, because it is holding up investment on the island, and this is because of what I believe to be a compliance culture that has become disproportionate, and as a consequence, anybody looking to use Manx structures, trusts and companies, which are vehicles by which we introduce investment here, is finding a minimum lead time, if they can indeed jump through the relevant hoops, of 3 to 6 months. Much business is not coming here because it's going to the Channel Islands, and I've spoken to senior management in CSPs who are in agreement with this observation, and they themselves are setting up Manx structures but using Channel Islands banks, which can turn things around in 24 hours in some cases. And I think we've been asleep at the wheel here, and there's been too much deference to the regulator, and as a consequence, with the reduction in competition in the banking sector because at its height, we had over 40 licensed institutions. Now we've got 12. It's all very well talking about diversification unless we actually address the fundamentals, and one of those is banking, and it's very serious. It's a de facto embargo on bringing capital in my opinion.
And Corlett, do you have any views on banking being an issue in the Isle of Man?
I think, you know, the lack of banks and the lack of availability to cash is causing a problem. But
Chris?
And Damien's right. We need to take advantage of the fact that we've got a changing regime at the regulator to review the approach to regulation. The Gambling Supervision Commission, as opposed to the Financial Supervision Authority, has always been complimented for how responsive it is to developments and to the marketplace demands. But at the same time, I think we've got to take a bit of flack ourselves as a community, because what do the owners of the banks hear about the Isle of Man when they listen to our local media? What they hear is that we still want to have more bank branches than other places around the British Isles. They don't hear that we want to be dynamic and create new products and speed up the process. They hear that it's absolutely vital that we keep having 4 bank branches in RAMSEY, for instance, which is what we've got at the moment. So we've got to, banking is already a major part of our economy. Diversification is bringing along new sectors. Banking is certainly a mature sector, but I do think we need to grow up in the way that we treat our banking investors, in fact more generally our insurance companies, our infrastructure investors, and in fact incoming investors. We do need maturer politics around that sort of thing.
Okay, thanks. I just want to ask another question. It's kind of linked to the economy. Chinese state media was recently quoted as saying that online gaming is opium for the mind. And the island also came out very badly in a recent article by a high-profile sports journalist on the same subject. Are you comfortable that the island seems to be doubling down in its efforts to grow online gaming and esports, given the negative reputation that often accompanies them? Chris?
Well, again, when we've looked at the economy back in 2014, after Ernst & Young, when the Department for Enterprise organised things, we already had banking and e-gaming as being mature sectors that would inevitably decline. And you identify one threat, and there are other threats to do with capital and to do with regulations that are coming along to do with tax-related challenges. So yeah, we have to be concerned about what anybody thinks about the industries that are important, and that's why we need to make sure that we've got a new 22nd sector to come along as one of the existing diversified economy declines.
Thank you. Anne?
I think there's a certain amount of pragmatism insofar as it's lucrative for us. I have real concerns with online gambling. I can't deny that. The very fact that, I can, or anybody can sit at home on a Saturday night after a couple of glasses of wine and gamble the housekeeping away without moving from the sofa and especially during lockdown. I mean, I was speaking to Motivate, the charity, very recently, and they've had a serious increase in gambling addiction over the COVID lockdowns. They are really concerned about it. I think that it's something that is going to cause us real problems in the future, social problems in the future.
Thanks. Damien.
Yeah, I mean, this really relates to that aspect of the human condition that leads people to be susceptible to addiction. And this is not in of itself a peculiarly Manx problem. Of course, we are aware that there's a gambling addiction problem. However, on the island, and clearly in view of those comments, those addictions are experienced understandably worldwide.
Do you think it reflects negatively on the island, though? The Isle of Man being a big player in those industries?
Well, I think the reality is you can turn it round. There is a potential negative outcome or perception, but I think we have to strengthen the regulation to ensure that, to the furthest extent possible in law, we protect the vulnerable, we ensure that there are proper safeguards in the way these products are marketed. But that does not remove the responsibility of a relevant jurisdiction around the world to ensure that it supports its own population in terms of, addiction support and counselling, because that is a responsibility of national governments. You can't simply throw your hands in the air and say, gosh, gambling's an awful thing. We have to respect freedoms, because if people want to gamble, that is up to them. What I think we have to support is the question of addiction. We clearly have some charities on the Isle of Man. I think they need more support in many ways. But it's a balancing act to be struck. I think as far as e-gaming is concerned, it's heavily reliant on technology. I think we have to be very mindful that it is here for the time it is here. It may be gone tomorrow. We've clearly benefited from its income. I think the key thing is that here we ensure that we act, and we are seen to be acting responsibly, but from an economic point of view, we recognise that the fruits of this industry may not be around for that much longer.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I believe we have a question from a member of the audience.
Yes. Damon, what I'd like to ask you, a little concern, is that predominantly you've mainly been a lawyer and an advocate. I have to say, I'm not too sure how that's going to go into running the island in government. And secondly, my experience being on the island for 20 years in listening and observing many NHKs, I see a lot of meetings and lots of talking and discussions, but I don't really see anything actually being implemented. And what I want an MHK who's got passion, who's actually going to implement what they are saying here. So could you answer that, please?
Okay, dealing with the first part of the question, that's right, I am an advocate, as I explained, so I'm a qualified lawyer. So what I can bring to the table is legal training in terms of the understanding and interpretation of legislation, and in particular to understand the downstream effects in the way that legislation can often, from implementation to the effect on people, it's understanding how that plays out. And I believe that my experience enables me to see that. So I believe that brings competence to the table as a legislature. As an advocate, I have been consulted over the years by politicians and ministers who've asked for my counsel on legislation and policy reform and how that might impact people down the tracks. I think as an advocate, you're used to and trained to represent others and their interests, and therefore I recognise, I think, appropriate boundaries, and also I think the importance of advancing their interests. In other words, understanding that you're ultimately accountable to your electorate. In relation to the second part, you're asking me about the issue of implementation. I think it's so important to maintain an ability to stand back, to be independent in your thinking. And as a lawyer, you're trained to be independent in thought, so that you properly represent and act as on behalf of others. I see the danger with any government and public sector culture is that you can be sucked in and you get bogged down in the detail and you can't see the high level. So in my view, I would want to be persistent and adopt people-focused policies consistent with my role as a representative of the people, and ensure that that we persist to achieve the objectives that we set for ourselves.
Okay, thanks, Damien. And Corlett, obviously that question was directed at Damien directly, but I guess the work of a constituency, MHK, a lot of it's done behind the scenes, not visible, and for good reason sometimes. And I guess the other part of the question was related to, we'll touch on the culture of government. I mean, do you have anything to comment on those two aspects?
What I would say is, yes, there are a lot of meetings. Yes, absolutely. And Parliament, although probably the most important part, is only a small part of an MHK's job, really, because you've got Parliament, you've got departmental work, scrutiny work, constituency work to try and manage. But for me, department work has been hugely important. It means, especially in health and education, because those are the two things I'm probably most passionate about. It inhibits your questioning ability in Keys and Tynwald, but actually it gives you a seat at the table, and that's the trade-off, and that's where you can really make a difference without actually getting any credit for it.
Yeah, thank you. Chris Thomas, you've been a minister and a constituency, MHK, of course. Mm-hmm. What would you like to respond in terms of the question as the question?
I am a passionate politician. I've been described as yellow in my sort of style of politics, and as much as I have empathy and I'm authentic and I listen and I act, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to carry on the discussion with Damien, because I think Damien is in a very interesting position if he's elected, because we've had an advocate as an MLC before who in theory don't have constituents, but quite often I've been involved with befriending people as they go through planning appeals or tribunals or difficult cases with independent review bodies or difficult cases with complaints. And to me, it's very fraught for a politician, and I just wonder how Damien would handle that, because I wouldn't want to be in his situation, because he does have more professional background and more professional risks in that sense, and it is always very dangerous. So, for instance, at the last Tynwald, the advocate who's already in Tynwald talked about the Manx public's got to understand that Tynwald can't change legal decisions, can't even change administrative decisions if they've been made. We can help people go to tribunals if the final decision hasn't been made. We can help the situation evolve in the future for people so that they don't suffer the trauma, but as such, we're in a difficult situation. And I'll perhaps come back to some practical issues that Anne and I have worked on, because I think that might be quite helpful for this discussion about what the nature of constituency work is and also what the nature of being an MHK is. Okay,
thanks. I'm just conscious of time. We've got limited time. We've got quite a lot of ground to cover. So if you don't mind, I'll move on to the next question.
Can I just say that?
Sorry,
as an aside to that, I think diversity in Parliament is hugely important, because we represent a diverse number of people, and therefore Parliament itself should encompass diversity.
Can I just interject very quickly? Chris, you referred to an advocate in the Legislative Council. I assume that you're talking about the Attorney General.
No, Jane Paul Wilson, a solicitor, an English solicitor.
She's an English solicitor, she's an Isle of Man advocate, just to make a distinction. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, currently there's no restrictions for new residents and investors in purchasing property in the Isle of Man. Given the problems that those who want to be first-time buyers are having getting on the property ladder, does this situation need to change? Anne Corlett.
I think we need to think seriously about this, because young people, first-time buyers, getting on the property ladder, it's virtually impossible at the moment. And you know, actually people wanting to invest in properties, I totally understand that, because if you've got savings at the moment, you're not going to get anything in bank and investments at the moment. So putting it into bricks and mortar is a really good idea for people to get some money back on their investment. But the, you know, the negative impact of that is that then we force our own young people, families, first-time buyers into rented accommodation. Once they enter into rented accommodation, they will never be able to save the deposit. It's a circle that they'll never get out of. So I think we always have a disinclination to protect our own, and I think we really need to rethink that.
Thank you. So you'd propose some kind of
I think we should
controls such as the Channel Islands have?
I think we should think about how we could do that without hugely impacting people coming into work, because we need people to come into work. We need that to drive the economy. But I do think we need to think about ways around how we can help people to get onto the property, either young people, Manx people, if they want to.
Thank you. Chris Thomas?
Yeah, housing is in crisis in several ways. That's one of them, and I do think we need to revisit the discussions around the Residency Act. If we need to have it on the statute book in modern terms so that it could be implemented. Firstly. Secondly, we can use the process of land registration and the fees around land registration, perhaps to help local people with a local connection as opposed to investment. But before we start that, I really do think that we need to make sure that's the public mood and the way I see it, because it's a massive change. For 40 years, people have been resisting residency controls in the island, so it would be a huge change. So this election is all about this issue in part. Housing seems to be top priority, and how we respond to it with practical terms is what really matters. And I do hope that by October, when the next government's forming the programme for government with consensus, prioritisation, I do hope we've actually got the public feel about this, because it's a pretty drastic step to be imposing Jersey, Guernsey style housing restrictions. But, you know, for me, I'm up for it if that's what it takes.
Thank you. Damien Chappelli?
Okay, housing is a complex problem, and I suppose it would be inappropriate to suggest that we rule that possibility out. I'm personally not in favour. I think the housing issue that we face has been in the making for a very long time. I think it boils down in no small way to the question of supply and demand, and that relates to our planning system. There are lots of opportunities to alleviate this problem. I think we're seeing a post-COVID bounce because of the delay in a lot of the conveyancing that would otherwise have taken place through the various lockdowns we saw over the past 18 months. But I think that there is an opportunity for government to look at planning laws, and in particular I'm attracted to the question of developing brownfield sites, particularly those in government ownership. I'm attracted to the idea of using the 300,000 square foot of vacant office accommodation on the island and looking and exploring possibilities of converting that in simple math. I know you wouldn't be able to convert all of it, it wouldn't necessarily be suitable, but if you could create 500 two-bed apartments with that, all in the towns, close to places of work, and that would be a lot more beneficial, I think, to the natural environment, because it would reduce the expansion into greenbelt territory. So that would need a look at the planning law and the procedures there. I think we've got to look at social housing. We've seen a lot of refurbishment and investment in social housing, but we haven't seen, as I see it, significant additional housing stock in that regard. And there are some within our community for whom that housing solution is appropriate. Another point, of course, is renting. There is the rental trap, as Anne has rightly said, but I would also say that I am unhappy with the Landlord and Tenant Act that has been enacted by Tynwald, because I think this is an example of legislation where they haven't considered the downstream effects, because it is making it unattractive for investors to continue to hold properties for rental. We are seeing properties being put on the market and sold so they are owned outright, so they're taking they're taken away from the rental market, which pushes the remaining rental market up in price because of the demand. I would have seen a more appropriate solution for the mischief that was targeted as being to introduce a tribunal in that respect to level up the imbalance between the parties, the tenant and the landlord, and that could have fast-tracked disputes regarding deposit retention and breaches of covenants on both sides. So I think that that to me that created a whole layer of red tape that is discouraging investment, and investment is important. So that is an example of the private sector dealing with the issue. So I come back to the supply and demand argument each and every time.
Okay, thank you. And call it, we build on brownfield and we refurbish. Do you agree?
Brownfield before greenfield, without a doubt. For Douglas, there are some good brownfield sites, and it makes absolute sense to build on this side, Douglas side of the Quarter Bridge, simply for traffic congestion as much as anything else. I think we need more rent-to-buy schemes to give people the opportunity to be able to save for a deposit. I think we should be encouraging developers to run those schemes as well. I do think we need to look at increasing the social housing stock because the waiting lists are too long, and some consideration given around what is the stock we've got suitable for today.
Thanks. Chris Thomas?
Yeah, both Anne and Damien make some good points, but I'll just pick up on a few of them and continue the discussion. The first one is that there are some government sites around Douglas, but for instance, Anne and I have got one of those sites earmarked for a new primary school, as in the Park Road site. It can't be used for everything. We've got to decide this election what's going to happen to the primary schools in Douglas Central, and if it's going to be needed for a primary school, we can't use it for houses. And most of the brownfield sites are actually in private ownership in Douglas, they're not government owned, and so therefore I propose that we need to actually use the new comprehensive treatment area approach, which ultimately allows for compulsory purchase to knock heads together in the next 5 years. And perhaps we also need to use the new Fair Trading Provisions Competition Act to begin to shake things up, and that's all stuff that was in preparation in my time responsible for planning policy. The other point I will make is that if you take West Quay, which is an important part of Douglas Central, when West Quay was being built, there was a massive crane behind West Quay that was supposed to going to be turning round and continue along Lake Road and filling all of that up with flats. But the reality was that the private sector found that the Manx public as yet wasn't into flat living inside towns. People come here when they're looking for a garden with kids and so on and so on. So that's why this election is so important. We can talk as much as we want about growing the economically active population and living on brownfield sites, but it's got to actually match the aspirations of the people who live here, and that's what an election is all about. An election is all about raising these big questions, getting a settled answer, and then actually implementing, just like the member of the audience suggested. After a time, you've got to stop talking, you've got to have a vision and then implement to that vision, and we've got an opportunity this next 5 years to fix the housing crisis in so many ways.
Okay, thank you. I just want to move on to climate change. That's another big issue, a big theme around this election. The Isle of Man government has an ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Is that ambitious enough? And call it.
No, it's probably not. I agreed with the 2050 because actually I think the date is a bit of a distraction. We should do as much as we can when we can, and aim for the zero emissions, not for the target date. Actions speak louder than words.
Thank you. Damien Chappelli?
Well, I think the point about the target is not really the issue. It's about what we're doing now. What positive steps are we taking now? And I believe that it's important that we take appropriate and proportionate steps to move this question forward. If bringing the target closer is going to concentrate minds, and perhaps that's a good idea. But I think we have to look at shorter term goals. So what are the goals for the next 2 to 3 years, the next 5 years? We've got to have milestones, I think, along the way, so that we can recognise that given the difficulties we've had with any sort of management project, quite frankly, as an island, I think we may well be kicking things into the long grass. So I see it as building up a series of practical, sensible and proportionate measures and setting targets much sooner so that we can see the thing unfold, and as we reach a particular achievement or a target or goal along the way, that will enthuse us to drive the whole thing forward and to work together as a community so that there's the buy-in, so that that government policymakers can work in tandem. I don't see it as being a top-down exercise. I think that's going to result in failure. I think it's very much about getting buy-in and creating manageable targets along the way.
Thank you. Chris Thomas, ambitious enough?
Well, I was one of the 7 who voted for the 2035, but both of the other participants in this discussion are correct. What we do in the next few years matters, and what we plan to do over the next 10 or 15 years matters most. And so therefore we've got, the way it's been described by Professor Curran and now government, is we've got to make some no-regret decisions immediately, which we then stick with. And to get to make those no-regret decisions, we've got to explain the implications of what we're doing when we make those no-regret decisions. And essentially there are 3 topics that really matter in terms of dealing with climate change. One is transport, and there are still some decisions that we need to make on the island, but basically, what cars we drive depends much more than on what we do here and what is done elsewhere. So it comes down to the major 2 things that we determine, which is housing and electricity generation. And in terms of housing, we can talk as much as we want about the standard of the new builds in the future, and that matters, and I've got strong views on that. But what matters more is how we deal with the vast mass of houses, a lot of which are older than the British Islands average, and pretty poor in terms of insulation. What we do with those, and that's why I was so disappointed with the housing scheme that came to Tynwald in July, and I voted against it because it wasn't ambitious enough, and that's what we should be spending a large part of our fund on. And then in terms of electricity generation, the sad reality is that if we move over to electricity, we're generating it from fossil fuels. So if we want to eliminate fossil fuels, we're not actually doing it. So therefore, we've got to make a massive decision. Do we begin to write off the gas infrastructure that we've got and replace it with new electricity interconnectors and the like? Or do we say to the Manx public, we will be using the gas infrastructure for 10 years, 15 years, and that's on the table this election. And if we are going to move over to electricity, what do we do first? And it seems to me, from all the things that I've said, the no-regret decision is to put in an interconnector, but that's going to cost £140 million, it seems, something like that. The same cost as the whole Poolrose power station, which is still in dispute and still talked about 20 years after it was put in place. So we've got to put on table to the Manx public this general election these big numbers and get acceptance that this is where we're going to, and a good understanding, and that's how we'll tackle with climate change in our island.
So basically you'd like to see us just hook up to the national grid?
So it's a no. We are already hooked up to the national grid and we export electricity. On one side, there are people who imagine that we can generate electricity and export to the UK. There are 2 problems with that. Number one, at the moment, the UK doesn't allow us to do that, and inside the Contracts for Difference regime, and the government's been trying for 7 years and hasn't got anywhere in persuading the UK to change its mind. And the second problem is the UK is 30 years ahead of us in terms of alternative energy, so they're producing it with scale much more cheaply because they've got historic infrastructure. So that's one perspective. We could try to generate it, and the other one is perhaps we could import into our network that we manage locally with local value added inside the network, cheaper alternative energy. But we've got to decide between those 2 options, and that's an important issue in this election.
Okay, thanks. And Colette, do you worry that the costs of implementing climate change policy will fall on the most vulnerable and the poorest in our society?
Especially with the climate change bill, it's more of a stick than a carrot. And, punitive actions will only result in impacting those who can least afford it. And it will be the vulnerable that will come out on the wrong end of that. Following on from Chris's points, he made a lot of good points there, but we don't have an energy strategy, a plan. How are we going to unhook ourselves from the reliance on fossil fuels? That's something we really need to lay out for public consideration and debate.
Thanks. Damien?
My observations here, in addition to the very good points made, is that we need to look very carefully. I come back to, looking at the size and scope of government in terms of the housekeeping and the balancing of the books and the way we manage projects so they don't overspend in the extraordinary way we have witnessed in recent years. And so we have to be very hard-headed about this as a small community and to identify, what is affordable and can we manage. So we're going to have to look at everything in the round. Yes, we've got to do our bit as responsible global citizens, but we've also got to be realistic that we are not going to be able to, by ourselves, change the course of history for the globe, but we can do our bit, and we have to manage our budgets very carefully because it's such a delicate balancing act when you look at all the responsibilities of government towards its people.
Thank you. Just want to move on, and this is for you initially, Anne. In your opinion, what is the key issue particular to the constituency of Douglas Central, and what would you propose to solve it?
There are, I think it's difficult to pick one. For me, having sat in education during the last administration, I think secondary school provision in the east, including Douglas, ONCHAN and Braddon, is hugely important. We have Ballacameen, which is a great school, but it's over capacity. And we have St Ninians that is under capacity. So I think we have to find it. Ballacameen now is reaching crisis point. There's new mobile classrooms going in for next year. They're actually looking for off-site premises to teach children in. That's not the way to do this. Satellite buildings for school are not appropriate. I thought we'd done away with that when, as a secondary school student myself, I walked up from Park Road to St Ninians every day. I think, I mean, my initial sense is that we could build the extra wing onto Bemmerhague and take Bemmerhague to 16. We could take Ballacameen to 16 and have a co-located sixth form at St Ninians. Now, I'm not an educator, and I think that is something we absolutely have to discuss. I've been very frustrated, I have to say, in education that this has not been the priority. As much as I've pushed it. But this absolutely has to be resolved in the very near future.
Okay, thank you. Damien Chappelli?
Okay, as I've been going around the constituency knocking on doors, one of the key issues that is constantly raised is around the road, pavement and traffic infrastructure question. And that is to say that the quality of life has been harmed because of the use of many roads in the Douglas Central constituency to bypass the main arteries into Douglas. And as a consequence, the roads are extremely busy. There are road traffic safety issues. And from a parking perspective, residents are getting very frustrated that they can't park nearer to their own doorstep. The quality and the condition of roads and pavements in the constituency is really diabolical in many areas. And so my priority is to use the savings gained from the review of spending with government, looking at some of these capital project schemes closely to again ensure that there are savings and to plough those into Douglas Central so that the roads, the pavements, the traffic calming measures are implemented to improve the quality of life for people in Douglas Central.
Thank you. Chris Thomas?
No, well, both those are excellent points, so to keep it interesting, we'll have top three priorities, if that's right. But just to build on the two things that Anne and Damien have suggested, excellent idea about the secondary schools, and that's something that Anne and I have been working on for a number of years and hope to implement it as soon as possible. And we've also got the issue of Scotland Jubilee. We've got 2 pretty new schools now with St Mary's and Henry Blue Noble in the constituency, and it'd be great to actually rectify the practically derelict Scotland Jubilee. And in terms of residential environment and traffic and safety, it's a project that we've spent a lot of time on, and DOI has actually prepared a plan which will be shocking to some people. It'll be provocative, and that's deliberate because we hope to launch that as soon as possible, and I know DOI hopes to launch it as soon as possible as part of a 5-year plan for improvement of the built environment in Douglas and elsewhere around the island. And I really hope that, whether or not I'm elected, that the Manx public in Douglas Central and elsewhere gets involved with what they want for Douglas, because it's pretty bold, the proposal that's going to be on the table. My constituency priority might be around health, because we've got some GPs in the constituency and also some GPs outside the constituency to which constituents go, and they're very fragile at the moment because the funding mechanism that's used by government doesn't actually suit Finch Hill, Snaefell, to an extent Kensington, group practice to a lesser extent, and we've really got to worry. I really worry that the primary at scale approach and the funding methodology actually is monitored, the application of it is monitored very closely, because it would be an absolute disaster in Douglas Central if we begin to lose any of the excellent community care facilities that we've currently got.
Okay, thanks so much. Right, that wraps up our questions for this evening. All that remains now is for each candidate to have their final word on why they should get your vote. And I think we'll do this in reverse order. So, Chris Thomas, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you again to Studio One and Energy and you, Richard, for this debate, and to 2 colleagues. I think it's been a very good start to this campaign because it's been friendly, professional, and ultimately it's a very important decision that's on the table for the voters of Douglas Central on the 23rd of September. What I'd like to say is that this election will take place using 2 changes that I brought about in the last 5 years. One of those is that only the 24 members of the House of Keys will vote for the Chief Minister, who will then choose the ministers who will be have a paramount role in forming the programme for government. But the public needs to be involved. So the second change I brought about is that we'll be delaying the election of the Chief Minister by 1 week after the election. And so therefore, to me, it's absolutely crucial that the public get involved in the policy choices and the policy decisions that need to be made for the short term and for 5 years during the election, so that those 24 MHKs can take into account what the public want and what the public have given a mandate to their 24 elected MHKs, so that we can put together for a programme for government that's not all about talk, as suggested from the audience this evening, but is about action to tackle the real priorities with real costs and a real plan to deliver, to meet the fundamental challenges that we have to do with housing, to do with climate change, to do with healthcare, to do with education, to do with balancing the finances, and to get in value for money from an accountable public service.
Thank you, Chris. And call it.
For me, really, it's just a simple message to say that, you know, this is not about me. This is about us, all of us. And I care about fairness, that we all get a fair crack of the whip. And all I can say is that, you know, my pledge, if successful on the 23rd of September, is to continue to work very hard and to represent the constituents of Douglas Central with enthusiasm, with integrity and with commitment. And I'm just hoping you, the people of Central Douglas, will once again place your trust in me to represent you.
Thanks so much, Anne. And finally, Damien.
Okay, well, my strapline is an advocate for change. I'm experienced in representing other people, and I would like the opportunity to represent the people of Douglas Central. I'm an independent thinker. I'm somebody who is not afraid to challenge the existing precepts and assumptions. I believe it's very important, given our precarious situation, the time bombs that we have discussed in terms of future liability for government or potential reduction in its income, we need to act now to ensure that we have a firm foundation on which to build a great future. The Isle of Man has enormous untapped potential. I've talked about reducing red tape, and that means a serious discussion between banks and the regulator and government departments to ensure that we are maintaining our competitive edge. Compliance is something that we're all encountering in our everyday lives, but compliance must be competitive, and I'm afraid to say it is the generally accepted view in the business community that we are falling way behind, and I intend to address that should I be elected. For the people of Douglas Central, they can be assured that my independent thinking, my fearless attitude and approach, but my ability to act as part of a team will ensure through persistence the right policies and the right decisions.
Thank you very much, Damien. Thank you again to the candidates for coming here tonight and giving us their views. Damien Chappelli, Anne Corlett and Chris Thomas. Sarah Hackman is also standing for election but was unable to join us. So now it's over to you. Where will your vote be going on September the 23rd? Thank you and goodbye.